Hello, hello, hello. It is Monday. This is the Religious Studies Project. I'm Chris Cotter. He's
David Robertson.
And we are brought to you, as you will hear throughout the podcast, by the BASR, NASR, and IAHR. Weather's getting a little bit better, though we still had some snow in Edinburgh in April, which was a little bit odd. Although apparently, according to social media, this had happened 6 years ago. It was dredging up photos of snow from April 2012 or something.
Well, it's not that unusual in the long term. It's more that recently winters have been mild. This is actually standard, because you'll know the old Scottish expression, cast not your clute till May be oot. Because the last frost dates in most of Britain, but in Scotland it's a week or two later, is in early May.
There we go. So I did not know that.
But spring is here.
Spring
There's green shoots coming up everywhere.
Yeah, and on that note, not on that note,
yeah,
I'm going to pass over to an interview that David recorded with Owen Coggins.
That's our worst link ever, but go with it. Go take ownership.
On drone metal mysticism. We'll find out what that is now.
I'm here in sunny Milton Keynes for the Open University's Contemporary Religion in Historical Perspective conference, where I'm lucky enough to be joined today by Owen Coggins, who is an honorary associate of the Religious Studies Department here. Welcome to the Religious Studies Project. We've been talking about this interview for
quite some
time, but we finally managed to get it organised. Luckily, just as your book comes out. Let's start then with drone metal. What is it that we're talking about here?
Okay, I guess I often describe it as an extreme form of heavy metal that's characterized by kind of extremes of repetition, distortion, extension, tracks that go on for 30 minutes, 45 minutes. So I went to a concert that was 3 hours long. And feedback and other kind of sonic characteristics. But it's also characterized in the sort of discourse that surrounds it, that's produced by musicians, but also by audiences. Lots of talk about mysticism and ritual and religious experience and transcendence and so on. And so that was the kind of starting point for me wanting to investigate it for my PhD research.
Now, this isn't the first kind of study we've had of religious imagery. Let's start with metal particularly. There's a long history of kind of fairly obvious religious imagery.
Yeah, and so I think sort of from Black Sabbath, who are often understood as the sort of originary starting point of heavy metal, and you've obviously got kind of crucifixes and press photos taken in graveyards and accusations about Satanism and various kind of imagined occult practices. And I think that a real interest in sort of the power of religion and its symbols and perhaps new or sometimes oppositional kind of repositionings of that kind of symbol, images and language and even sounds, has, I think, been a really important part of metal from its beginnings. I think perhaps what seems to me to be slightly different about this particular form, certainly in the way that academics have approached it, is that religion in metal has often been kind of approached through the lens of Christianity and metal, whether that's Christian heavy metal itself or discourses of anti-Christian sentiment in metal, sort of burning down churches in Norwegian black metal and so on. And more recently, sort of more focus on various intersections of Satanism and paganism in metal. But it's often kind of approached in terms of a religious tradition and metal, whereas what I was really interested in is the sort of bricolage and sometimes quite kind of Orientalist appropriation and redeployment of a really vast range of different kind of religious symbols and sounds in this particular form of music.
Now, the use of religious imagery in metal particularly, I mean, it's a very sort of deliberately transgressive kind of discourse. Although obviously it varies how serious they are.
Mm-hmm.
But that's not entirely what we find with drone, is it?
Yeah, well, I think the issue of seriousness is quite an interesting one, and I think it's often I think humour in metal is often misunderstood as perhaps one optional counterpoint to seriousness. And I think, and so I think that's an interesting way to look at these things, because in some ways there are things which are done very, very seriously, which are at the same time completely ludicrous and absurd. One example is the classic 1996 record by Sleep, which has two alternate titles: Jerusalem, which references these kind of ideas of a Holy Land pilgrimage, and also Dope Smoker. So these Dope Smoker and Jerusalem are two alternative titles for this one single hour-long dirge classic of stoner metal riffs. And it's often kind of referenced by listeners in terms of the lyrics being simultaneously ultra serious and completely ridiculous at the same time. And I think that kind of is an interesting way to think about how some of these symbols might be mobilized and ideas might be responded to, which in the book I talk a little bit about an idea of listening as if. And I think in some ways drone metal allows, in the ways that audiences talk about it, are going to concerts or listening to recordings as if they're ritual, as if they're mystical, as if they're somehow related in an ambivalent way to religion. And that kind of language sometimes shifts around. So the record I mentioned is often described, even in the space of a short 500-word review, for example, as like a pilgrimage, or as a pilgrimage, as a sonic pilgrimage, as sounding like the music that pilgrims might listen to at the end of the pilgrimage. And so I think this kind of ambivalence that I kind of talk about as listening as if it's ritualistic allows people to sort of explore and investigate a kind of imagined religiosity without having to necessarily commit to certain kind of identity statements or dogmas or beliefs. And I think that's part of where the power lies. And I think that also is part of the real value of music in this kind of exploration, because it affords a sort of imaginative space in which for people to kind of explore that.
And that's something that's not unique to music, of course. That kind of mode is familiar in other forms of art that have got, there are visual artists and painters who specifically design their work to be experienced in these kind of contexts. You made a nice distinction in the book about different modes of engaging with, like, certain kinds of music are engaged with in a different way than, I think you distinguish, like, pop and rock and their mainstream musical forms, that there's a different register of engagement with it.
Yeah, I think that was really sort of, I mean, I don't necessarily want to make big claims about sort of the specialness of drone metal in against the forms of music, but this was really responding to the ways that the research participants talked about it. And there was often a very listeners often made a very strong distinction between drone metal and other forms of music, and often even drone metal and other forms of metal, in partly because of the sort of the abstract nature of this kind of very droning dirge-like music, and the practicality such as how long the tracks last. The real interest in vinyl as kind of creating a separate space and time in which to listen, like that people preferred to listen on vinyl rather than on digital formats, because it created a certain kind of special space and time around through which to listen. And I think that really spoke to the kind of construction of ideas about ritual and mysticism in this kind of music, that there was a deliberate attempt to separate drone metal in sort of space and time, but also conceptually as something kind of set apart. And obviously there's an implied construction of the sacred in that.
Yeah, that notion of specialness is something that I've actually come across in a few places. It's quite interesting when even like for students talking about the study of religion, they want it to be something that's, set apart. Even the discourse itself is something separate. Yeah, I like that you mentioned the material culture, and there's a number of interesting intersections here. I mean, the vinyl aspect of it is already talked about, but there's also particular aesthetic that goes along with particularly drone metal. But we also have material culture in terms of sensory experience.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think it was. I mean, firstly, it was just great to kind of speak to people about this certainly quite extreme form of music and read thousands of reviews and things just because of the creative and unusual ways that people talked about it. And that was one of the ways that came up a lot was people sort of talking about going to concerts and the air becoming solid or having a sort of physical bodily experience of the sound. And so I thought that, material culture was actually a really kind of helpful way to think about that because it was almost like sound becoming kind of physically mobilized for people or them kind of engaging with sound in a very physical way. And I think that was an interesting way to kind of think also about mysticism in terms of the ways that people kind of use or interpret or operate on a particular kind of tradition, in this case kind of heavy metal, I suppose, as well as a sort of surrounding discourses about kind of transcendental experience and mysticism and so on, that it was almost a kind of a way to experience sound as sound rather than or what sound itself sounds like or what sound itself feels like, as some of my participants put it. Which I think, connects up to other aspects of the aesthetic in quite interesting ways, such as the interest with black letter or fracture typography, like the sort of Gothic script that's familiar in a lot of metal cultures as well as drone metal. And what I loved about that was it's a real visual kind of manifestation of the distortion and amplification of a sign that's so important in the sonic characteristics of the music.
I found that really interesting, the idea of this sort of fetishization of amplification. It is noticeably different than most other forms, even mainstream rock and metal. That there's much more concern on the drum kit or the guitars rather than, but in drone it's the amplification particularly. And what I found interesting, having been a rock musician, was that when you started talking about this, I was thinking, well, you've got the first stage of amplification you need in rock is that you've got to be louder than the drums because you have to play the drums loud to make them sound good. So there's a level of amplification you need to get your guitar to there for the band to sound like a rock band, right? But in drone, that bit becomes the bit that's of interest, and you go up a whole other level so that it's the amplification itself that becomes the act. It's no longer something that you're doing in order to get to point A. It becomes point A itself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's. I mean, I've suggested that this is the first, or at least the only, musical culture that I know of where the most important musical instrument, broadly conceived, is the amplifier rather than the guitar, or, as you say, sort of anything else that's being amplified. Although interestingly, there is a real focus on amplification and speakers in dub reggae and certain forms of electronic dance music, which I also kind of discuss, because those forms of music have also attracted really quite sort of prevalent discourses of religious experience and mysticism. But yeah, definitely, I think the amplification as it's sort of the amplification of amplification is the thing that's really at issue. And I think that's an interesting way to think about that, is that it's about kind of an interrogation of transmission itself and amplifying kind of symbols themselves in order to kind of investigate what their possibilities are, rather than, for example, kind of communicate particular kinds of musical semantics or structures.
Yeah, it makes me, when you mentioned dance music, I immediately pictured the front of 3 a.m. Eternal by the KLF, where it's an altar, and the sides of the altar are huge amplifiers. And of course, the KLF were enormously influenced by situationist theory and the kind of post-hippie kind of early cybernetic idealism, Tim Leary and those kind of people. And they were very sort of consciously creating a temporary autonomous zone, but they were using a lot of religious imagery in doing it. Even the idea of time, so it's 3 a.m., but it's 3 a.m. eternal. They have a lot of these similar kind of languages.
And I think the idea of drone itself is very much about kind of, it affords ways of talking about time, which kind of do similar things. That they're physically and bodily experienced in a particular moment, but they sort of open out onto these kind of ideas about kind of archaic experience and forms of social organization. And so I thought, I kind of in the one of the chapters in the book also kind of talk about those ways that audiences talk about drone metal being kind of about elsewheres, and drone metal being giving access to these elsewheres that people discuss in terms of being transported to outer space or to kind of imagined empty deserts and so on. And I think that's a really kind of powerful and important way that people respond to it. Not to say that sort of there's anything inherently connected in the music, but just that those are conventional ways of talking about the music that have kind of sprung up around it, which seem to kind of have a certain validity for people who are communicating about their engagement with this music.
Nonetheless, I find that really interesting, and we really are thinking about utopias in the original sense of the word, of nowhere, of places that are idealizations or imagined spaces in some sense, that there's almost a sort of attempt to achieve through these kind of transient and drone kind of ideas.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think there's in dub and psytrance and in drone metal, which as I said, I sort of compare, there are different kinds of utopias, and I think you can also sort of, working backwards from there, think about the reasons why there's such a strong impulse to try and construct these utopias in a very kind of temporary way, just over the course of a half an hour recording or an hour or so of a live concert. So, for example, for dub, in terms of a Black Atlantic diaspora, we're kind of wanting to kind of construct certain ideas about an Afrocentric religion, for example. And I think perhaps for drone metal, it's interesting sort of to speculate perhaps about a kind of what the construction of utopias might say about the social situation of audiences that kind of as a response to kind of alienation and disenchantment.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And interestingly as well, almost pre-modern, despite the fetishization of technology. There's a lot of wildernesses and distant places, and it's almost away from modernity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there was an interesting example when one of the best-known drone metal bands, Sun, performed at the Royal Festival Hall a couple of years ago. They were supported by, the support act was a group from Russia called FERPA, who've supported Sun on a number of occasions, who style themselves as performing authentic Bon Tibetan traditional chanting. And so when you see these two things juxtaposed, the Tibetan Bon ritual, where there's kind of bowls of incense and figures in black robes doing vocal chanting, and then you go out and have your glass of wine at the break time, and then you go back, and then there's a very similar performance with the Sun band members in their black robes, but it's a very kind of consciously updated version of this with like these extremes of amplification, but sonically quite a similar palette, I suppose they're working with, and I think that's a very deliberate association that they're trying to make with a certain kind of imagined archaic ritual.
Sorry to interrupt the episode, but we just wanted to let you know, to remind you about our Patreon link. The Religious Studies Project has always been free since its inception, but we know that there's a great problem in academia with people not being paid for the work that they're expected to do, particularly early career scholars. And we at the RSP want to be part of the solution, not part of the problem. So you can help if you can spare even £1 a month by going to patreon.com/projectrs and subscribing. We know that these podcasts are very useful for people who are teaching and people in their learning. So if you can help either by subscribing there or by making a one-off donation using the PayPal button on our website, it would be greatly appreciated and will help us keep bringing you this podcast for free and fight against exploitation in academia. But now, back to the episode.
Let me give you a deliberately kind of provocative question then. So we've got a kind of sense of sacredness or specialness, or however we want to call it, or temporary autonomous zone, however we want to put it. And we have quasi-religious musical forms. Which comes first? In which direction is the movement, or is it mutually reinforced?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's a good question. It's one that I tried very hard to skip.
I said it was deliberately provocative.
But in order to skip it, sort of focus rather than kind of trying to. There was put it this way. There was a lot of claims about when in my interviews and in sort of reviews of this kind of music that drone metal really does hark back to ancient, in quotes, tribal religious forms and so on. With their kind of, and I think this is kind of deliberately played on by some musicians, and it's certainly picked up on by parts of the audience. But my interest wasn't so much kind of proving or disproving whether this really genuinely had connections to ancient religion, and in the same way that the sort of the group performing the Tibetan ritual music that I mentioned, I'm not so interested in historical accuracy of their early music kind of production. What's more interesting to me is kind of how those ideas are mobilized and why people find them important to draw on now. And I think in part it's kind of an attempt to make an authority claim, or perhaps to recognize and after the fact legitimate something that they've felt as quite a powerful engagement. And then in order to sort of kind of situate that for themselves and for the kind of the listening community to sort of connect it to these older imagined forms.
Tell us then about how this relates to mysticism. And this is a large part of the book, obviously. Mm-hmm. I presume we're building from the kind of idea that this is music which is deliberately experienced rather than passively heard.
Mm-hmm. Yes, so I think, I guess following on from what we've been discussing, there's also quite a strong discourse of kind of perennialism that you find in Aldous Huxley and so on, in the way that people talk about it, that it's accessing this kind of universal underlying form of religious experience. Now that, to me, there are some sort of troubling consequences of that kind of idea that just erases all kind of specific differences. And there are some issues with a kind of an Orientalist sort of grabbing of bits and pieces from all religions and kind of presenting them as if they're referring to a similar thing. So for me, what was really valuable in trying to understand these kind of discourses of mysticism and ritual given that so many people who are coming from different kind of backgrounds and so on are using words that are notoriously difficult to pin down, such as it was a spiritual experience, or it was this music is mystical in some way. For me, it was really valuable to look to the work of Michel de Certeau, who both provides a really valuable way to look at the uses that audiences make of texts in popular culture, and also his work on mysticism. And this approach to mysticism, instead of kind of trying to look behind the texts for this kind of unitive experience, which the scholar imagines is the same behind all of these particular instantiations, Michel de Certeau, by contrast, sort of wants to look at the texts which are designated mystical and then identify certain kind of procedures or gestures or operations on an inherited language that take place in these texts. So for me, that was really valuable for a start, because it kind of resolves or displaces a kind of division between text and experience, which has been quite influential and quite problematically so, in my view, in the sort of 20th century study of mysticism, where there's an idea that, you know, mystical experiences are ineffable, they're indescribable, and then you have texts which sort of fail nobly to describe them. So the problem with that is that the experience that's suggested as being the same, there's not really any evidence for that, and then the actual kind of differences in texts are just attributed to the cultural differences in which these same experiences take place. Michel de Certeau, by contrast, sort of allows us to actually kind of look at the particular kind of mechanics and moves and gestures that actually take place in these texts. So, for example, talking about how a language of the body emerges in the mystical texts, or texts designated mystical in the 16th and 17th century, how they're interested in the materiality of signifiers, how mystics are seen by themselves as ultra-orthodox, but by outsiders as heretical in some way for their kind of treatment of their inherited tradition. And so I think there was a number of these kind of gestures that Certeau identifies in mystical texts that I also observed in not only the ways that audiences spoke about their engagements with drone metal, but also in the sound itself. So we had similar, in the ways that people talk about going to concerts, you find these very similar and familiar gestures of talking about mysticism and ritual. But I also thought it was quite a good description of what drone metal does to the tradition of heavy metal. So it, for example, takes on lots of signifiers from Black Sabbath, but kind of overextends them and pushes them to their breaking point. So, for example, the Sleep album I mentioned earlier was described memorably by Julian Cope in a review as if a bunch of California teenagers had found Black Sabbath's first 4 albums in the desert and started a religion based on it.
I love that. Yeah.
And so I think you can see that just even in the sound, that it's almost like taking a Black Sabbath song and extending it for an hour, sort of almost pushing it to its limits. And I think, this sort of fits with Certeau's idea of mysticism as an operation or a performance in a text, which kind of does something to an inherited tradition.
Using drone metal, then, are you using it? You're not so much using it as an example of mysticism, but as an example of how the language of mysticism is operated. Am I understanding?
Yeah.
And does that have ramifications for other, like more widely, for how we talk and think about mysticism? Yeah,
I think so. I think that it helps to avoid some of the pitfalls of mysticism, which, as I sort of described before, about kind of conjuring the sort of fiction of an essentialist, universalist experience, which actually relies on particular ideas about subjectivity, which are kind of rooted in a Western academic episteme, I suppose. And I think that's perhaps particularly important in our kind of contemporary political moment, where we hear references to the 20th century study of mysticism in growingly in political discourse. So, for example, Steve Bannon and Richard Spencer making mention of Julius Evola, and that's a very, very problematic imagination or depiction or mobilization of ideas about mysticism. Evola kind of wanting to forward, as he described it, a racism of body, soul, and spirit, and a sort of involvement in the school of fascist mysticism. So I think these ideas can certainly be taken in some very troubling ways, and I think at root they're often based on a kind of essentialism and universalism, which can be found in relatively benign forms in the ideas of sort of Huxley and Eliade and others, but which I think Certeau gives us a much more sort of both ethically and epistemologically grounded way of actually approaching mysticism. In addition to actually saying, if we look at kind of the mechanics of what happens in the texts which are called mystical, then that's actually a much more empirically based way to look at mysticism than kind of imagining these kind of supposedly pure visionary experiences.
Great. So what's next for you? Where do you take this next?
Good question. I'm really interested in, as I sort of start to talk about in the final chapter, how this kind of relates to anthropological ideas about ritual, and how that might be connected to ideas about the connection between music and various forms of social structure and imagining social structure. So Jacques Attali's ideas about noise, for example, and which I think, given that this form of music is very much about distortion and feedback and noise, I think there's maybe some interesting connections that can be made with sort of the ideas of Mary Douglas, for example, about the importance of dirt and the positioning of those things in ritual. I'm also really interested in kind of wading into debates about kind of heavy metal and mental health, and it's often been described as, or associated with, delinquency, both in kind of popular media, moral panics, as well as also in a certain amount of academic literature.
In fact, heavy metal fans are statistically happier and healthier than the norm, I believe, according to a recent survey.
Yes, well, yeah, I think you've got to take all of these things with a pinch of salt. I mean, and I think that's that's perhaps why it's so interesting, because I think the debate is so polarized. But I'd actually want to kind of maybe make room for the fact that maybe some kinds of music can be good for you and other kinds of music can be bad for you, and that maybe the debate's a bit more nuanced and complex than some of these polemic positions have suggested.
We love nuance here at the Religious Studies Project, so thank you for taking part.
Thanks for inviting me. It's been very interesting.
And before we go, I just want to remind the listener to rock hard, rock heavy, and rock lobster.
It's wonderful to hear you and Owen droning on there, David.
Nice. And, I hope the conversation didn't get too heavy. That was recorded at the Open University's Contemporary Religion and Historical Perspective Conference, which was it was in February, so a couple of months ago. That's the second interview we've had from there, and we've got one more to come.
Fantastic. That was a productive conference for everyone then. Good. Regular visitors to the RSP site will notice that, we've still been having some issues. I think the last time that we recorded, we moaned a bit about our previous host and that you should never use them. Moved to a new host, so hopefully this general stability of the site existing.
Yeah.
The site will keep existing, but there's some issues with the PHP on the site, which is already lingo that's a little bit too fancy for me. But the features will still be there. Podcasts are still there at the moment. The podcast will always still be there through iTunes, Player FM, Google Play,
YouTube. Yeah.
So if things do get a little bit disrupted over the next few weeks, we sincerely apologize. We wanted to do this redevelopment over the summer when we were in our break. But,
yeah, unfortunately, the problems with our previous host forced our hand. You'll have maybe been aware that we were down for most of a week, and that was why. That wasn't anything to do with us, but we had to fix it. So, yeah, there is a bit of disruption, but not as much disruption as there would have been had we not dealt with it, unfortunately.
Exactly. So podcast output will hopefully be continuing as normal, which means that next week we'll have an interview that I recorded with a cultural anthropologist, cognitive anthropologist, primatologist, with Professor Agustin Fuentes of the University of Notre Dame, and he was the Gifford Lecturer at the University of Edinburgh back sort of end of February, start of March, and so the interview, I think I've called it like Belief, Evolution and the Human Niche or something.
Why do we believe evolution, primates and the human niche?
So he takes a wonderful evolutionary perspective. We talk a lot about primates, because in the title there, and just and he's got a very interesting model of belief, which sort of pushes beyond that sort of what we might think of as a Taylorian conception.
Excellent. Sounds fascinating. Sounds like the kind of thing that Tommy usually does. So, yeah.
Exactly. I think Tommy was quite jealous that he could not come to the lecture, but hey, maybe he's writing the response. I don't know.
Yeah, that's Thomas J. Coleman III, our managing editor, and he's the hub in the wheel that is the Religious Studies Project.
The spider at the centre of the web.
Absolutely. We don't need to. I keep doing that. I keep going to do as always, and you can find us on the. We don't
streamlined that.
Yeah, we've improved things,
professionalized.
So yeah, well, what else is there to say, Chris?
Thanks for listening.
The Religious Studies Project is sponsored by the British Association for the Study of Religions, the North American Association for the Study of Religion, and the International Association for the History of Religions.
Brought to you by founders and editors-in-chief Chris Cotter and David Robertson, and managing editor Thomas J. Coleman III. Our features are edited by Jonathan Tuckett, and our opportunities digest by Jana Shirley. Podcast transcription by Helen Bradstock, with audio assistance from Gregory Schneider and Samuel Ward. Social media managed by Ray Radford, and sales and marketing by Sammy Bishop.
Don't forget, you can support the project using our amazon.com, .co.uk and .ca links, or by donating at patreon.com/projectrs. And you can find us on Facebook, Twitter, Google+, YouTube, iTunes and other portals.